Hi, this is Sniz with Bloodbane Alliance on World 11. I'm going to be doing this video on raiding level 3 and 4 dungeons. The reason I'm doing this video is because I think this is about the stage where increasingly raiding is going to be an important part of resource production. As well as I think it's a good opportunity to learn some of the unit characteristics for future war. When I say raiding, I'm talking about raiding dungeons, not other players. I believe at this stage we should definitely still be in the mode of building resource cities, strategically positioning, and not building any castles for probably quite some time. As far as dungeon raiding, this is turning out to be as the dungeon levels, higher level dungeons become available. And I'm covering specifically dungeons here, but bosses, even though losses are a little higher, are actually also very much worth going after, although they tend to have higher losses, the same return on gold if properly configured, but they do have the bonus of the artifact. So if it's a boss level with an artifact that you're going to use, then it's probably worth hitting a boss. I apologize in advance. I'm going to be getting a little bit into the math here. For those that are not into math, maybe tune out for those parts, but it's fairly important to at least understand why this is becoming increasingly important. I'm going to take a second to, well, first of all, this is my main city. This is the dungeon that I've just appeared for me, and I'm going to start farming. It's a level 3. I've been hitting this level 3 forest dungeon. At one point I hit that one, and also a couple of my other cities because it's a little closer hitting that level 3 dungeon as well. But I'm going to cover basically units from my main city to these two dungeons and cover a little bit of the distance. This will probably be a two-parter because there's a lot to cover here. The important thing to understand is that you have a raid queue. And just like a build queue, you can have 5 raids going at one time. You do need to be aware, even though trade does not affect this, sending settlers to settle a new city does take a raid slot. So you do not want to fill up your raid queue right before settling a new city, because you will be stuck for 3 hours waiting for them to return, as I was with my first city. So basically you can send 5 raids at a time, and the key to successful dungeon raiding is to make full use of that queue. Send it out on cooldown to the most efficient available, and even at higher levels that is not necessarily always going after the highest level possible dungeon. Because this is mostly about what your troops can carry. It mostly has to do with the possible loot that a dungeon will have, and how much your troops can carry. At some point, the dungeon simply isn't capable of producing enough to make it efficient, but for the most part, you're sizing your armies to fully utilize the queue and to carry as much loot as you can. Ideally, you have your army perfectly sized so that after losses, you're taking just as much as you can fully carry without leaving much behind. If you oversize your army, you increase your losses, because losses are a percentage of units sent. So if you send a army 3 times the size as is appropriate, you'll take 3 times the losses. It will cost you 3 times as much. It will take just as long, and you'll get the exact same loot, because there's only a certain amount of loot that will drop. By the same token, if you send too small of an army, you'll end up sending too few troops, and you won't be able to take back as much as you can carry, or as much as was there. You'll just take back as much as you could carry. So this is all about time and sizing. One more thing on the size of the army. It is far better to send all 5 of your raid queues out with slightly undersized army than it is to send less raids with oversized armies. It's only at the point that you have enough troops that you can saturate a dungeon that you're better off actually keeping any troops back, or maybe sending just a little extra. I'll get to the spreadsheet part, and this is a fairly long, complex spreadsheet. Actually, let's start with the wiki, because that's what a lot of people are looking at. Most of the wiki data is pretty correct, but I want people to understand how to read it, because I'm not sure I know it was confusing for me right away. The dungeon level, the maximum foes. This is the max loot per foe, and when it says loot per foe, this typically comes in more at about the 25 range. This is the total of the resources. So if there were 300 resources, that might be whatever iron, whatever stone, whatever food, whatever the breakdown is, and that's based on dungeon type. for a total of, in this case, 300 resources if there were 10 foes, each dropping 30. That does not count gold. On top of that, based on that number, you'll get a certain amount of gold. And the percentage of gold that you get in earlier dungeons is actually much higher. So at a dungeon level 1, if you were to get 300 gold or 300 in resources, you would get twice that in gold. So you'd get the 300 resources if you sent the troops capable of carrying it and there were enough mobs there that dropped that. You would also take back 600 gold, which doesn't weigh anything. It doesn't. You don't worry about your unit's carrying capacity. So a level 2 dungeon is roughly a maximum of 40 foes, dropping roughly 30 each. That's basically how to read their table. Now I'm refining this a little bit, but it's pretty accurate. So as a general rule of thumb, they're saying that if you send units, each raid, not the total, but each raid should be enough to carry 30 times 4 in a level 2, for example, or 30 times 117 in a level 3, for example. Now I'm finding that these numbers are high as far as the maximum foes you can meet, and also so is that max loot per. We're getting about 25 gold each. However, my belief is I also haven't seen a dungeon past about 30% progressed. So my guess is you get deeper into the dungeon and you're going to see higher numbers, more on the higher side of those numbers, and more on the higher side for loot. So right now I'm configuring for what I would say my recommendations are based on the fact that you're probably doing the first 25-30% of the dungeon. You might need to reevaluate those numbers as you get further in. So that's basically how to read the table. It's not a bad rule of thumb, it's just a little confusing. So if you go by these max loot figures, if each raid has enough to carry that loot, you'll get that much loot, and it is exactly 80% of the total loot in gold. Loot is the total of all the resources, and not counting gold. And the berserkers suggested is basically how many berserkers they say, each carrying 10. I am strongly starting to favor cavalry, and I'll cover why probably in part 2 of this.